The Arctic, a barren and unforgiving landscape, is home to countless mysteries, some of which have remained unsolved for decades. Among the many enigmas are the stories of vanished ships, long-lost civilizations buried under layers of ice, and flights that have disappeared without a trace. One of these mysteries, Flight AE-17, was particularly haunting. On Christmas Eve 1976, this passenger plane simply vanished. No wreckage was found, no distress signal was ever sent, just a gaping hole in the air and the imagination. For 40 years, Flight AE-17 and its 150 passengers became the subject of whispers, theories, and unanswered questions. That was until a satellite scan picked up a metallic anomaly deep within the Alaskan ice fields in 2016. Researchers were optimistic they had finally uncovered the lost aircraft. But as the excavation began, something felt amiss. Unusual patterns appeared in the ice, markings where no human being had ever stepped. And then, there were the eyes, watching from the desolate expanse. The truth of what happened to Flight AE-17 was not just about survival, it was something more extraordinary, something that bent the rules of logic and redefined the relationship between man and nature. The recovery team would soon uncover a reality that not only solved the mystery of the lost plane but changed everything. Jason Wright, standing in his office in Anchorage, gazed out the window at the slowly drifting snow. At 58, Jason had spent over 30 years working in Alaska, studying its harsh wilderness. But nothing in his long career had prepared him for the satellite images he had just received. The metallic anomaly detected by military satellites back in January had initially seemed like just another routine investigation. But when Jason examined the preliminary scans more closely, he felt a deep unease, one that had nothing to do with the winter cold. His hands trembled as he overlaid the dimensions with known aircraft specifications. "It matches," Sarah Chin, his research assistant, whispered, staring at the image. Flight AE-17. The name hung in the air like a heavy weight between them. Flight AE-17 was a legend in Alaska, one of the most infamous aviation mysteries in history. The plane had disappeared without a trace on Christmas Eve, 1976. For over 4 decades, the fate of its 150 passengers had remained a tragic question mark. Jason's voice was steady, despite the shock. "Get me Thompson at the National Science Foundation," he instructed. "And contact Dr. Elena Martinez at Wildlife Services, we'll need her expertise for this." Within days, the investigation grew into one of the largest recovery operations in Alaskan history. The National Science Foundation fast-tracked their funding request, and the U.S. Air Force offered logistical support. But despite the growing momentum, Jason had a gut feeling that they were about to uncover something far more profound than just a crash site. Elena Martinez arrived in Anchorage in early February, braving the bitter cold of a harsh Alaskan winter. At 62, Elena was one of the world's leading experts in Alaskan wildlife behavior, with a particular focus on large predators. She was a no-nonsense researcher, known for her sharp instincts and the depth of her knowledge. The meeting room was already filled with specialists from various fields: glaciologists, forensic archaeologists, aviation experts, and survival specialists. The operations briefing was underway. Jason pointed to a topographical map, highlighting the area where the wreckage site was believed to be. "The site is about 80 miles northeast of Anchorage," he said. Temperatures average around -42 degrees Celsius, with wind speeds reaching up to 18 meters per second. "This won't be easy." Elena leaned forward, her gaze fixed on the satellite imagery. "The ice field's topology is unusual," she observed, tracing a series of irregular lines with her finger. "These patterns here, they don't follow typical glacial movement." Jason's brow furrowed. "What are you thinking?" he asked. "I'm not sure yet," Elena replied. "But in my experience, when nature deviates from the expected, there's usually a reason." The team spent the following week preparing for deployment. More than 84 tons of specialized equipment were assembled, including thermal drilling units, ground-penetrating radar, mobile laboratories, and enough supplies to sustain a 30-person crew for 2 months. Among the team was Tom Harrison, a seasoned ice pilot with 25 years of experience flying search and rescue missions in Alaska. During one of the planning sessions, he shared his memories from the original search for Flight AE-17. "I remember when 107 went down," Tom said, his voice tinged with emotion. "I was just a kid back then, but my dad was part of the search team. He never got over not finding them. The weather that Christmas was the worst he'd ever seen." The convoy departed in early February, a procession of heavy-duty vehicles making their way across the frozen landscape. Elena rode in the lead vehicle with Jason, her eyes constantly scanning the horizon. Something about the terrain felt off to her, patterns in the snow, anomalies in the ice formations. "Stop," she suddenly called out, her sharp command causing Jason to signal a halt to the convoy. She pointed to a patch of snow. "See how the surface texture changes? There's a reason animals aren't crossing this section." Further investigation revealed a dangerous ice cavity that could have swallowed one of their vehicles. Elena's keen observation had saved them from potential disaster, but it also raised questions. How had she spotted it so quickly? "Years of studying predator behavior," Elena explained with a slight smile. "They leave clues if you know how to read them." After days of meticulous preparation, the team finally established base camp, a small city of reinforced tents and portable structures designed to withstand the brutal Arctic conditions. Despite the harsh surroundings, the atmosphere among the team was focused. They were all aware of the gravity of the situation, yet there was an air of anticipation. This wasn't just a routine search. The discovery of Flight AE-17 had the potential to answer many long-held questions, but it also seemed to be pushing the boundaries of the unexpected. The wreckage site lay less than a kilometer away, its presence marked by a barely visible tip of the aircraft's tail fin protruding from the thick layer of ice. As the team approached, they noticed a peculiar presence that had been there for days: a bobcat, a large female, accompanied by 2 nearly grown cubs. The mother bobcat was behaving strangely, not fleeing at the sight of humans, but neither was she approaching the camp. She seemed to be monitoring the area, almost as if she had a vested interest in the team's activities. Elena, always observant, couldn't help but be intrigued. She observed through binoculars as the bobcats moved deliberately across the icy terrain, clearly marking safe passages. "Remarkable," Elena murmured, her voice filled with awe. "Look at the size of those paws. They're much larger than typical bobcat prints." Jason, who had spent decades working in Alaska, was familiar with wildlife behavior, but what he was seeing was unusual. "They're adapting well to the conditions, aren't they?" he said, though there was a sense of uncertainty in his voice. The behavior of the bobcats was unlike anything anyone had witnessed before. The mother bobcat's careful pacing, followed precisely by her cubs, was a display of intelligence beyond the expected predator awareness. "They're avoiding the weak spots in the ice," Elena observed, her eyes narrowing with intrigue. "This is more than just normal behavior. It's almost as if they're aware of the danger, as if they're protecting something." The entire team, fascinated by the bobcats' apparent understanding of the ice field, began referring to them as the guides. Their behavior suggested a long-term knowledge of the terrain, patterns that could have been passed down from previous generations. The team began to realize that these creatures weren't just passive observers. They had been actively maintaining a kind of guardian role over this area, ensuring the safety of anyone who passed through. And now, as the recovery operation began in earnest, it seemed the bobcats were guiding them to safety. Elena spent much of her time documenting the bobcats' behavior, keeping detailed notes of their movements and patterns. It became clear that they were marking specific areas, avoiding others, and keeping a watchful eye over the team. Despite the team's best efforts to conduct their work efficiently, the bobcats remained a constant presence, almost as if they had been waiting for the excavation to begin. The operation itself was grueling work. The team used thermal drilling units with surgical precision, carefully excavating the ice surrounding the crash site. Every movement was measured, every decision weighed. They worked tirelessly, and as the hours passed, it became clear that the Bobcats weren't just observers. They had been a part of the landscape for much longer than anyone had anticipated. The first breakthrough came when they breached the fuselage of the aircraft. The sight that greeted them inside the cabin was haunting. The scene was almost perfectly preserved, frozen in time. Magazines lay open on seatback trays, their pages suspended in mid-turn. A flight attendant's serving cart was still in the aisle, with coffee cups arranged neatly atop, now frozen solid in cylindrical blocks of ice. But what struck the team the hardest were the personal effects scattered throughout the cabin: a child's doll with carefully braided yarn hair, a wallet containing photos of smiling families, letters written but never sent. These items told stories of lives interrupted, of dreams halted by an unexpected tragedy. As they moved toward the cockpit, they discovered a captain's logbook, the final entry describing a harrowing situation: multiple engine failures, deteriorating weather conditions, and the pilot's growing concern. But it was the flight attendant's diary that would prove most revealing. Her diary contained entries spanning 18 days after the crash, offering a chilling account of the survivors' last days. December 25, 1976. If you can call this light dawn. 22 survivors out of 150. The impact was devastating, but the real killer was the cold. So many died in their sleep that first night. We gathered in the first-class cabin. It's more intact, easier to heat. Captain Matthews is organizing us, rationing the emergency supplies. Julie, the other surviving flight attendant, keeps trying to make people comfortable. How do you comfort people who've lost everything on Christmas Day? December 27, 1976. The radio isn't working. No sign of rescue. Captain Matthews says we're at least 100 miles off our last reported position. The storm that brought us down was unlike anything he'd ever seen. It threw all the instruments off. We can hear animals outside sometimes, strange sounds, not wolves. Something else. December 30, 1976. Down to 19 now. The cold is unbearable. Julie noticed something odd today. There are tracks in the snow around the plane, but they seem to be keeping other predators away. Captain Matthews thinks we might have crashed in the territory of some large cats. Somehow, that's comforting. January 5, 1977. Only 12 left. We're out of emergency rations. Julie didn't wake up this morning. The strange thing is, we found fresh kills near the plane. Rabbits, small game, as if something is leaving them for us. Captain Matthews says that's impossible, but we're past believing in impossible things. The diary entries continued, and though the dates became increasingly uncertain, they maintained a clear account of the survivors' desperate efforts to stay alive. The final entry, dated January 11, 1977, would be the last. I'm the last one now. The others are all gone, but I'm not alone. They're out there. I can see their eyes in the dark. Not threatening, just watching. Waiting. I understand now why they've stayed close. They're the guardians of this place. They know what it means to survive here, to lose family here. The mother cat brought another rabbit today. I couldn't reach it, too weak to move now. I think she understood. She sat there in the snow for hours, just watching. I'm not afraid anymore. When the end comes, I won't be alone. As the team worked to piece together the mystery of what had happened, Elena and Jason realized that they were not just uncovering a tragic story of human survival, but something much deeper. The Bobcats had been a silent, constant presence during those final days. They had watched over the survivors and protected the crash site for over 4 decades. Elena Martinez continued to pore over the diary entries, the weight of the survivors' words hanging heavily in the air between her and Jason. What they had discovered was both unsettling and awe-inspiring: a bond between the passengers of Flight AE-17 and the bobcats that had existed for generations. The more Elena analyzed the data, the more she became convinced that this connection went beyond mere survival instinct. The bobcats had been playing a role in this story that was far from ordinary. These cats, Elena mused one evening, her voice steady but tinged with awe, they're displaying characteristics beyond normal territorial behavior. The diary mentions them bringing food to the crash site. We've documented similar behavior in present-day cats. Look at this photograph, she said, pointing to the image of a freshly killed rabbit placed carefully just outside the team's work area. These aren't abandoned kills. They're strategically placed, always at times when we're resting. It's as if they're watching over us, guiding us through this harsh environment. Jason, though skeptical, was slowly beginning to see Elena's point. You're suggesting that these are the descendants of the same cats mentioned in the diary? He asked. He had always believed in the power of nature, but this was beginning to stretch the limits of what he had thought possible. Elena nodded slowly. Bobcats typically live around 10 to 12 years in the wild, but we're looking at several generations here. I believe these cats are descendants of the ones that witnessed the crash. And they've inherited not just the territory but the behavior of their ancestors. They've been protecting this site for 40 years. The more the team worked, the more evidence they uncovered to support Elena's theory. The distribution of supplies, the placement of bodies, and the survivors' accounts all suggested that there had been an organized survival effort. Small caches of food were found at regular intervals around the crash site, preserved remains of small game animals carefully placed in hidden locations. The bobcats had been providing for the survivors long after the crash, offering them sustenance in the harshest of conditions. As the recovery operation progressed, they uncovered another stunning discovery. 6 weeks into the mission, Sarah Chan, Jason's research assistant, was analyzing ice core samples when she noticed something unusual. These striations in the ice, she said, pointing to the patterns in the layers, they're not random. Look at this pattern. It's as if something repeatedly traveled the same paths around the crash site, year after year, wearing grooves into the ice. Elena and Jason exchanged a glance, both realizing the implications of what they had just uncovered. The grooves were unmistakable. Generations of bobcats had followed the same paths their ancestors had taken. They had been maintaining a vigil for decades, protecting the crash site and the memory of those lost there. They've been protecting this place for 40 years, Elena whispered, as the gravity of the discovery settled over them. The bobcats are not just guardians of the land, they're guardians of the memory of this tragedy. The recovery operation came to an emotional close in late March. The remains of the passengers and crew of Flight AE-17 were finally returned to their families, and the personal effects, preserved in the ice for 4 decades, were carefully handed back to loved ones. The diary, which had been such a crucial part of unraveling the mystery, was donated to the Smithsonian Institution as a historic artifact. But it was the story of the bobcats that truly captured the public's imagination. Wildlife documentaries were filmed, research papers published, and the crash site became a focal point for scientists studying animal behavior and intelligence. Elena Martinez, whose career had been defined by her work with large predators, now found herself drawn into a new field of study, the remarkable behavior of these extraordinary creatures. In the years that followed, Elena established a research station near the crash site. She and Jason, now semi-retired, continued their work documenting the bobcat's continued presence and behavior. They found that the mother bobcat, now graying around her muzzle, still made her daily rounds, still brought small offerings to the memorial that had been erected at the site. The cubs, now older and more independent, maintained the same careful watch over the area. One evening, 5 years after the discovery, Elena sat in her small research station, watching the newest generation of cubs learn the same paths their ancestors had walked. The mother bobcat, ever vigilant, moved gracefully through the snow, her cubs tumbling behind her. Elena smiled softly as she watched the scene unfold. "You know what I think?" she said, turning to Jason, who had joined her for the anniversary of the recovery. I think that first mother bobcat recognized something in those survivors. Not just as prey or predators, but as living beings, struggling to survive in a harsh world. And somehow, she passed that recognition down through generations. Jason nodded thoughtfully, his gaze following the mother bobcat as she led her cubs along the familiar path. An inheritance of compassion, he murmured. More than that, Elena replied. A reminder that even in our darkest moments, we're not alone. As the sun began to set, painting the ice field in shades of pink and gold, Elena watched the mother bobcat and her cubs disappear into the gathering dusk. The sight was breathtaking, a living testament to the bond that had formed between the survivors of Flight AE-17 and the bobcats that had watched over them. The story of the bobcats had become more than just a tale of survival, it had become a profound reminder of the interconnectedness of all living things. It was a story of empathy, compassion, and guardianship that transcended species and time. The bobcats, who had maintained their vigilant watch for decades, had shown the world that even in the most desolate and unforgiving places, compassion could take root and flourish. As the team watched the bobcats disappear into the twilight, Jason reflected on the final words in the flight attendant's diary, "I'm not afraid anymore. When the end comes, I won't be alone." The legacy of those lost aboard Flight AE-17 would live on, not only in the memories of the survivors and their families but in the eyes of the bobcats who had kept their vigil for nearly half a century. Their story, and the lessons they imparted, would continue to inspire generations to come. Years passed, and the story of Flight AE-17 and the bobcats who had watched over the crash site continued to captivate the world. Elena Martinez, now fully dedicated to her research, had established herself as a leading authority on the behavior of the bobcats. She had even set up a permanent research station in the heart of the Arctic wilderness, right where the crash had occurred, and made regular trips to monitor the growing family of bobcats that had lived on the ice fields for decades. Every year, on the anniversary of the crash, Elena would sit at the edge of the site, gazing out over the now iconic location, the sun setting behind the jagged ice cliffs. There, she would see the familiar procession of the mother bobcat and her cubs, slowly and deliberately marking their ancestral path in the snow. The wildlife photographer, Sarah Chan, who had captured so much footage during the initial expedition, had joined her as well. Together, they documented the continuing legacy of the bobcats, noting every detail, every change, and every unique behavior that would further help their research. "It's incredible," Sarah remarked one evening, as they watched the bobcats from a distance. "After all these years, these animals are still following the exact same paths their ancestors laid down. They are a living connection to something far older than us." Elena nodded in agreement. "They are a reminder that life isn't just about survival, it's about the connections we make along the way." These cats were not just protecting the survivors of that crash, they were honoring them. And in doing so, they passed on the message of care, empathy, and survival to future generations. They're teaching their cubs how to navigate not only the physical world but the emotional and psychological world as well. The research had drawn attention from every corner of the scientific community, with numerous universities and institutions eager to learn more about the incredible bond between the bobcats and the passengers of Flight AE-17. Wildlife experts, behavioral scientists, and even historians came to visit the site, each eager to study the unusual and unprecedented patterns that had emerged. "Elena," Jason said one morning, as they stood on the observation deck of their research station, "have you ever considered the possibility that the connection between these bobcats and the crash site goes beyond just survival instincts? There's something otherworldly about the way they watch over this place. They seem to understand something that goes beyond logic." Elena looked out across the frozen landscape. "I've thought about it," she replied softly. "I can't explain it, Jason. It feels like more than just animal behavior. It feels as though they have a deep, intrinsic understanding of what happened here, and they've carried that knowledge with them through generations." Jason was about to respond when Sarah, who had been out in the field gathering data, returned with urgent news. "Elena, Jason, you need to come with me. You won't believe what I just found." The three of them followed Sarah into the lab, where she was holding a small, weathered object in her hand. It was a doll. The same one described in the diary, the one that had belonged to a child on Flight AE-17. Its hair was matted, its body worn by the icy conditions, but it was unmistakably the same. Sarah had discovered it near the crash site, half buried in the snow. Elena took the doll from Sarah, her hands shaking slightly as she held it. This was a child's toy. A symbol of innocence, of a life lost. And now it's been returned. By the Bobcats. Jason looked at the doll in disbelief. How could they know? How could they recognize something so personal, so human? Elena's voice was soft but resolute. I don't know. But I do know that they've been watching over this site for decades. They are more than just animals. They are guardians of this place, of the people who were lost here. And now they're returning the one thing that ties it all together, the doll. The final piece of the puzzle. They stood in silence, the weight of the discovery sinking in. The Bobcats, it seemed, were more than just protectors of the land. They were the keepers of a memory, of a tragedy that had never truly been allowed to rest. And now, after all these years, they had returned a piece of that memory to the world. Weeks passed, and the story of the Bobcats and the flight's survivors continued to capture the imagination of the public. News outlets from around the world were covering the developments, and scientists were publishing papers and making breakthroughs. Elena and her team had uncovered something extraordinary, something that defied explanation. They had found a connection between humans and animals that no one had ever considered, something that went beyond survival, beyond instinct. It was compassion. It was empathy. It was a legacy passed down through generations of Bobcats. But the most significant discovery came when they found another hidden part of the wreckage, a hidden compartment in the fuselage that had not been uncovered in previous expeditions. Inside, they found the final remnants of the cockpit's instruments, which had been carefully preserved by the ice. There, among the wreckage, they found the captain's logbook, the last entry describing the final moments of Flight AE-17. The entry revealed a surprising twist. Before the plane went down, the crew had made a final desperate effort to send a distress signal. They had done everything they could to alert the authorities, but the cold and the storm had disrupted their communications. The final words, scrawled in a hurried scrawl, said, "We may not make it out, but I know one thing for sure, there's something out there. Something watching over us." Elena held the logbook in her hands, reading the final entry aloud. Something out there, watching over us. Her voice trembled with the weight of the discovery. The Bobcats, she whispered. They were watching over them, even then. Even before we understood their role. Jason nodded slowly. They were always here. Always protecting. Always waiting. The excavation of the crash site marked the end of one chapter but the beginning of another. The legacy of Flight AE-17, and the Bobcats that had guarded it, would continue to resonate with all who came to learn its story. It was a reminder that in even the most desolate and inhospitable places, life could find a way to protect and nurture. And as the years passed, the Bobcats' presence remained constant. Their paws continued to tread the ancient paths, following the same routes their ancestors had walked for generations years after the incredible discovery at the crash site, the legacy of Flight AE-17, the mysterious guardianship of the Bobcats, and the bonds between man and nature continued to shape the understanding of wildlife behavior. Elena Martinez's work had garnered worldwide attention, and her research had opened the doors to new scientific exploration in the field of animal empathy. Her station near the crash site had become a focal point for international researchers and wildlife experts, all eager to study the behaviors of the Bobcats that had become so intertwined with the tragic story of Flight AE-17. On a crisp autumn morning, Elena and her team were out in the field again, carefully monitoring the movements of the newest generation of cubs. These young Bobcats, the descendants of the original guardians, were being taught the same paths their ancestors had walked, paths that had been etched into the ice by years of survival and protection. The mother bobcat, now aging but still strong, continued to lead the way, her every movement an example of the wisdom she had passed down through generations. Elena stood silently with Sarah Chan, watching the bobcats move through the snow. The two had become inseparable in their efforts to document the bobcats' behavior. As they observed the animals, Elena reflected on how far they had come since the days of the initial discovery. The connection between the bobcats and the human survivors of Flight AE-17 was undeniable, a bond forged through tragedy, survival, and an unexpected sense of guardianship that transcended species. "Do you ever wonder," Sarah asked quietly, her breath visible in the cold air, "what the passengers of Flight AE-17 would have thought if they knew these cats were watching over them all those years?" Elena smiled softly, her eyes following the bobcats as they trotted along their familiar path. "I think they would have found comfort in knowing they were not alone. That, even in the darkest of moments, there was something out there looking out for them." Sarah nodded, her gaze focused on the cubs who were now playfully darting through the snow, mimicking their mother's movements. It's like they knew. Somehow, they knew how to protect them. The idea of animals being more than just creatures of instinct had become central to Elena's research. The bobcats had not only protected the survivors of Flight AE-17, but they had also remained guardians of the crash site for decades, ensuring that the memory of that tragic event would never fade. Their actions had blurred the lines between animal instinct and human empathy, demonstrating that compassion could exist beyond the realm of humans. As the team continued their work, they were visited by other researchers, wildlife photographers, and even conservationists who wanted to learn from the bobcats' behavior. Elena had been invited to speak at conferences around the world, sharing her findings and discussing the profound implications of what they had discovered. The story of Flight AE-17 and the bobcats who had watched over it had become more than just an isolated event, it had become a symbol of survival, empathy, and the interconnectedness of all living things. One day, as Elena reviewed the final reports of the bobcats' behavior and the ongoing preservation efforts at the crash site, Jason joined her at her desk. "You know," he began, taking a seat beside her, "we've learned a lot from these cats. But I think the most important lesson is one we might have missed at first." Elena looked up, intrigued. "What do you mean?" Jason leaned back in his chair, his eyes thoughtful. "All this time, we've been studying the bobcats, the way they protect, the way they pass on knowledge. But it's more than that. They're teaching us about resilience, about how, even after tragedy, life can continue. They're not just protecting the memory of those lost, they're living it. Every day, they're surviving in the harshest conditions, passing on what they've learned to the next generation." Elena absorbed his words, a new realization dawning on her. "You're right. It's not just about survival, it's about continuity. The bobcats have been keeping the memory of those passengers alive. They've turned their suffering into something that transcends time. And they've shown us that even in the most desolate, unforgiving places, there is a purpose to every life, every action." The team continued to gather data and analyze the bobcats' behavior, their lives intertwined with the legacy of Flight AE-17 in ways no one could have predicted. Elena and her colleagues worked tirelessly, ensuring that the story of the bobcats and the crash site would be preserved for future generations to study. As the years passed, the memory of the bobcats and their guardianship became an enduring symbol of hope and compassion. The crash site, once a place of loss and devastation, was transformed into a memorial, a place where people from around the world could come to reflect on the profound connections that bound them to the natural world. The bobcats, though few in number, continued their vigil. Their descendants still roamed the ice fields, following the paths of their ancestors, leaving their mark on the land that had become a testament to survival and love. The Arctic, once a harsh and unyielding place, had become a sanctuary, a living monument to the enduring power of compassion, the bond between species, and the idea that no one, no matter how small or seemingly insignificant, is ever truly alone. In the final years of her career, Elena wrote her last research paper, a reflection on the lessons she had learned from the bobcats and the story of Flight AE-17. "The connections we make," she wrote, are not always visible to the naked eye. Sometimes, they transcend the boundaries of species, of time, and even of life and death. The bobcats of Flight AE-17 have shown us that compassion, guardianship, and memory are not confined to humans alone. They are a universal language, spoken by all living beings who understand the meaning of survival. And so, the legacy of the bobcats, of the passengers of Flight AE-17, and of the profound bond between all living creatures continue to inspire those who visited the Arctic, those who studied its harsh beauty, and those who believed in the power of empathy to bridge the gaps between worlds. The story of the bobcats remained an enduring testament to the power of guardianship, compassion, and the unbreakable threads that tie us all together, no matter where we come from or what we've lost.